Welcome back, everyone. In this lecture on Jane Austen's novel Emma, I'm going to begin with a brief account of the author's life and literary career. Following this, the lecture will provide you with further details and contexts and modes of interpretation that should help you make the transition from a casual reader of the novel to one who is better prepared to appreciate Austen's achievements in the art of narrative fiction and her place within the history of the novel in England. I hope what you learn in the lecture helps you to think and talk about Emma in newly revealing ways, whether you're coming to the book for the first time or whether you've read it before. My intention today is also to bring you up to speed about what advanced students and scholars of Jane Austen's work say about Emma, what the main issues have been in the more than 200 years that this wonderful book has stirred conversation, discussion, and critical commentary at the same time that it has entertained and delighted and intrigued readers the world over. In order to join this conversation and make your own contributions to understanding the text along with your classmates, you will want to know something about the social class into which Jane Austen was born, a class of people she both esteemed and criticized throughout her adult life. Classes and social ranks are an inseparable component of English society, and for many American readers, this aspect of studying the English novel can sometimes seem a bit elusive or complex. I'll talk about the relationship between Jane Austen's social class, which is usually designated as the landed gentry, as well as other classes in English society below and above that level. I also think it's important to know something about how the composition of classes underwent significant change in the generations following that of Austen's, so that books like Middlemarch and Great Expectations feature characters that we only begin to see coming into prominence at the edges of Jane Austen's fictional world. I'll also place Austen's life and work into its particular historical period, and then say something about the kind of novelist she is. By this, I mean delving into the early roots of literary realism, explaining in a general way where that style and content has come from, and why it gradually attained the predominant status as a high literary art, while other vastly popular forms of fiction, like the picaresque novel, the romance, the novel of letters, historical novels, and the new nationalist work of brilliant writers coming from the margins of the British Empire, such as Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, all receded or were largely incorporated into the dominant genre of realism that was inaugurated by Jane Austen and continued through the work of later novelists like George Eliot and Henry James. Once I do that, I'll talk about the particular place of Emma in both Jane Austen's other novels and in the context of the developing literary history of the novel form. What kind of novelist is Austen, and what are her particular achievements? How do we distinguish her achievements from those of the other writers we're studying this quarter? What criteria of judgment should we use? What do readers like and take away from Emma, and what do they sometimes miss? How does Emma work as a text, as a linguistic puzzle, as a formal structure? How does Austen conceive of characters, both as individuals and as social types, as representations of people, and linguistic signs that are full of meaning? I'll go on to talk about the book's narrative devices, looking at the deceptively straightforward way the third-person narrator tells the story, or at times lets the characters speak to reveal themselves, or look closely at the way Austen's narrator doles out judgments in the subtle shifts in tone, attitude, and humor. And finally, I will conclude with the questions we are still left with after reading Emma, and suggest some of the many avenues we can follow to address those questions more satisfactorily. But first, who really was Jane Austen? And what does it mean today to read the product or the brand called Jane Austen? About the life of Jane Austen, we know far less than we would like to know. Austen was very modest about her genius, and she didn't leave any extended commentary about her writing, although there are some tantalizing hints here and there, as we'll see. Her authorship of the 4 novels that were published during her lifetime remained unknown until after her death, which was not unusual for female authors of her time. When Northanger Abbey and Persuasion were published posthumously in 1818, they were accompanied by a biographical notice included by her brother, Henry Austen, which revealed for the first time the author's name. Additional evidence about the author's biography is hard to come by, coming as it does from a small number of preserved letters that Austen wrote, and from a few remembrances written by her surviving family members. During her own lifetime, Austen may have written as many as 3,000 letters, but only 161 of them survive. Writing such an enormous number of letters over a lifetime was not at all uncommon for any literate young woman of a certain class in the early 19th century, not to mention really anyone who could use paper and pen to write them. This is how young women in particular spoke, as it were, with their absent friends or family members, sometimes writing more than once a day, every day. We might liken it today to sending texts or instant messages to our closest circle of friends and family. Letters and letter writing, you will have noticed, circulate through nearly every textual layer of Emma's intricate network of transmitted messages, organizing the novel's shifting points of view, its advancing plot details, and revealing character traits. Letters are an integral part of what we read in the book, and what the characters read as well. We spend a lot of time hearing what the characters think about the letters that they read and write, each new letter from someone setting off a stream of alternate interpretations, drama, and speculations about the meaning of the text. And this is exactly the point of Emma. It is a text about the writing and reading of other texts, about interpreting or misinterpreting the signs within those texts. And not just texts, but people also, their actions, their behaviors, their moods. Many of Jane Austen's own letters were written to her older sister Cassandra, who in 1843 burned the greater part of them and cut pieces out of those that she kept. Ostensibly, Cassandra destroyed or censored her sister's letters to prevent their falling into the hands of relatives and ensuring that, quote, younger nieces did not read any of Jane Austen's sometimes acid or forthright comments on neighbors or family members, unquote. From what biographers of Jane Austen tell us, this unfortunate situation was made even worse by successive generations of the family, who expunged and sanitized the already sketchy details of Austen's life. The heirs of Jane's brother, Admiral Francis Austen, for example, destroyed even more surviving letters. Details were excised from the biographical notice that her brother Henry wrote in 1818, and family details continued to be omitted or embellished in her nephew's subsequent book, A Memoir of Jane Austen, published in 1869, as well as in William and Richard Arthur Austen Leigh's biography, Jane Austen, Her Life and Letters, published in 1913. The legend the family and relatives deliberately cultivated about their famous ancestor reflects their biases in favor of good, quiet Aunt Jane, portraying a woman whose domestic situation was always happy and whose family was the mainstay of her life. But as Austen scholar Jan Fergus explains, modern biographies now tend to include the details that were excised from the letters and family biographical materials. These restored materials reveal a more complicated person, one who experienced periods of unhappiness, depression, and disappointment, living as an unmarried woman within a family whose members were not always very pleasant. Jane Austen was born in Steventon, Hampshire, England, on December 16, 1775, shortly before the American Revolutionary War broke out in the British colonies on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and 14 years before the French Revolution violently erupted much closer to home in 1789. She was the second daughter and youngest child of a clergyman named George Austen, who served as the rector of the Anglican parishes at Steventon and nearby Dean. He came from an old, respected, and wealthy family of wool merchants, but as each generation of eldest sons in that family received their increasingly divided inheritances, this family wealth diminished greatly by the time George married and had a family of 7 children. The Austens lived within modest means, but they had many wealthier friends and relatives. They were respected members of the lower gentry, a somewhat precarious status that I'll explain in a moment. Austen's mother, the former Cassandra Lee, was also from a prominent family of Oxford clerics who grew up among the upper gentry. Women of such families usually received an inheritance of lesser value from their mothers, and so Cassandra was able to contribute to the family income after her mother's death. Over the course of Jane Austen's 20-year career as a publishing writer, incidentally, she earned a grand total of £1,000. As was the custom in England at the time, Austen's father, George, received a lifelong appointment and a salary as the rector of a parish through family connections. In this case, the wealthy husband of his second cousin, a man named Thomas Knight, who owned Steventon and its associated farms, one of which the Austen family rented to live in. This may be one possible source for the character George Knightley in the novel, although that name was chosen for a number of other important symbolic reasons. This typical kind of arrangement of renting land and small farms from large landowners is represented in the novel by the prospering Martin family. The novel's most property-rich character is, of course, George Knightley, who owns the estate called Donwell Abbey, as well as the thriving Abbey Mill Farm, the largest in the area. It's also clear that he owns all the land that comes under the designation of Highbury, a village of perhaps 800 to 1,000 residents of various trades and classes. The Woodhouse estate is called Hartfield, and it's not part of Knightley's property, although it is said in the novel to form a kind of notch in those lands. The Woodhouses are an old, respected, wealthy family in their own right, occupying the highest rung of gentry in their immediate area. Emma's family is ranked higher and wealthier than Mr. Weston's, but not as wealthy and land-rich as Mr. Knightley's. Remember, too, that Knightley's brother is married to Emma's sister, and that their son will eventually inherit the estate and lands of the elder brother, George Knightley, if George remains unmarried and childless. The Austen family relied upon the patronage of their relatives and hosted frequent visits from numerous family members. From 1773 until 1796, George Austen supplemented his income by farming and by teaching 3 or 4 boys at a time who boarded at his home. The Reverend Austen had an annual income of £200 from his two livings. This was a very modest income at the time. By comparison, a skilled worker like a blacksmith or a carpenter could make about £100 annually, while the typical annual income of a gentry family was between £1,000 and £5,000. This may give you some idea of the perspective from which Jane Austen observes, comments upon, and subtly critiques the various levels and relationships among class, income, and social status in her novels. You might be wondering what kind of education young women like Austen were given at the turn of the 19th century, given the somewhat skeptical tone the narrator uses to describe Mrs. Goddard's school for girls in the novel Emma. In 1783, Austen and her sister Cassandra were sent to the town of Oxford to be educated by a Mrs. Anne Cawley, who took them with her to Southampton when she moved there later in the year. In the autumn, both girls were sent home when they caught typhus, and Austen nearly died. From then on, Austen was home educated until she attended the Reading Abbey Girls' School with her sister. The school curriculum probably included some French, spelling, needlework, dancing and music, and perhaps drama. It's very much like the country boarding school represented in Emma, where the abandoned Harriet Smith boards and receives her education. The Austen sisters returned home in December 1786 because the school fees for the two girls were too high for the Austen family to pay. After 1786, Austen never again lived anywhere beyond the bounds of her immediate family environment. The remainder of her education came from reading, guided by her father and her brothers James and Henry. Her father's home library, however, was large and varied, constituting a school in and of itself. Her father allowed both sisters the use of expensive paper and other materials for their writing and drawing, and largely approved of Jane's humorous send-ups of contemporary literary conventions. From the age of 11, and perhaps earlier, Austen wrote poems and stories for her own and her family's amusement. In these works, the details of daily life are exaggerated, common plot devices are parodied, and the stories are full of anarchic fantasies of female power, license, illicit behavior, and general high spirits, according to the literary critic Janet Todd. Austen compiled copies of 29 of these early works into 3 bound notebooks, now referred to as the Juvenilia. Between 1793 and 1795, between ages of 18 and 20, Austen wrote Lady Susan, a short epistolary novel usually described as her most ambitious and sophisticated early work. It's unlike any of Austen's other works. Claire Tomalin describes the novella's heroine, for example, as a sexual predator who uses her intelligence and charm to manipulate, betray, and abuse her lovers, friends, and family. After completing Lady Susan, Austen began her first full-length novel, Eleanor and Marianne. This would become the basis for the novel Austen published anonymously as Sense and Sensibility in 1811. Austen began writing a second novel entitled First Impressions, later published as Pride and Prejudice. She completed a draft of it in August 1797 at the age of 21. As with all of her novels, Austen read this newest work aloud to her family as she was working on it, and it became an established favorite. At this time, her father made the first attempt to publish one of her novels. In November 1797, George Austen wrote to an established publisher in London to ask if he would consider publishing First Impressions. The publisher returned Mr. Austen's letter, marking it declined by return of post. Austen may not have known of her father's efforts. During the middle of 1798, she began writing a third novel, with the working title Susan, later to be called Northanger Abbey, a satire on the popular Gothic novel. She completed her manuscript about a year later. In early 1803, Austen's brother Henry offered Susan to a London publisher who paid £10 for the copyright. The publisher promised early publication and went so far as to advertise the book publicly as being in the press, but did nothing more. The manuscript remained in his hands, unpublished, until Austen repurchased the copyright from him in 1816. In December 1800, George Austen unexpectedly announced his decision to retire from the ministry, leave Steventon, and move the family to Bath, near the southwest coast of England, where, by the way, Mr. Elton's wife is from in the novel. Jane Austen didn't like Bath, and her general discomfort and unhappiness there slowed down her writing considerably during this period. Following her father's relatively sudden death a few years later, Austen's mother and unmarried sister Cassandra found themselves on less stable financial grounds. They would move again several times to various locations in southern England, eventually settling in Chawton, where Jane's brother lived. One way, of course, to alleviate these financial concerns was to marry a suitably wealthy man. Jane did, in fact, receive and accept a proposal of marriage from a man of this sort, but, upon reflection, reversed her decision the next day. He was the heir to extensive family estates located in the area where the sisters had grown up, but, as one commentator has described him, he was a stout, unattractive, opinionated man, somebody who, quote, seems to have been a man very hard to like, let alone love, unquote. One thing probably factoring into Jane's rejection of this suitor, whose name incidentally was Mr. Bigwither, has to do with an earlier infatuation she had with another young man whose family was of very modest means and could not at that point offer his hand in marriage. In 1814, Austen wrote a letter to her niece, who had asked for advice about a serious relationship, telling her that, quote, having written so much on one side of the question, I shall now turn around and entreat you not to commit yourself farther, and not to think of accepting him unless you really do like him. Anything is to be preferred or endured rather than marrying without affection. At the time Austen lived and wrote her novels, married British women did not have the legal power to sign contracts, and it was common for any woman wishing to publish her writing to have a male relative represent her to sign the contract. Like most women authors at the time, Austen had to publish her books anonymously. The ideal roles for a woman were as wife and mother, and writing for women was regarded at best as a secondary form of activity. A woman who wished to be a full-time writer was felt to be degrading her femininity. So books by women were usually published anonymously in order to maintain the conceit that the female writer was only publishing as a sort of part-time job and was not seeking to become a literary celebrity. During her time at Chawton, Jane Austen published 4 generally well-received novels. Through her brother Henry, the publisher Thomas Egerton agreed to publish Sense and Sensibility, which, like all of Jane Austen's novels except Pride and Prejudice, was published on commission, which means at the author's financial risk. When publishing on commission, publishers would advance the costs of publication, repay themselves as books were sold, and then charge a 10% commission for each book sold, paying the rest to the author. If a novel did not recover its costs through sales, the author was responsible for them. The alternative to selling via commission was by selling the copyright, where an author received a one-time payment from the publisher for the manuscript, which occurred with Pride and Prejudice. Austen's experience with Susan, the manuscript that became Northanger Abbey, where she sold the copyright to the publisher Crosby and Sons for £10, who did not publish the book, forcing her to buy back the copyright in order to get her work published, left Austen leery of this method of publishing. The final alternative of selling by subscription, where a group of people would agree to buy a book in advance, was not an option for Austen because only authors who were well known or had an influential aristocratic patron who would recommend an upcoming book to their friends could sell by subscription. Sense and Sensibility appeared in October 1811 and was described as being written by a lady. Jane Austen died at the age of 41 from what is now known to be either Addison's disease or non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Through the last days of her painful illness, she managed to complete her final novel, Persuasion, and nearly all of another one called Sanditon. She is buried in Winchester Cathedral. Readers of the novel Emma are often struck by the book's lack of a plot, especially when compared to other novels of its time and novels that follow it, such as Charles Dickens's elaborately plotted Great Expectations. Austen's earliest critics tended to notice the same thing, as did her most famous and successful literary contemporary, the novelist Sir Walter Scott, who reviewed Emma favorably in a magazine. It remains the only full-length review of one of her novels to have appeared in her lifetime, and what Scott has to say still has relevance. Although he admits to readers that Emma has even less of a story than either Sense or Sensibility or Pride and Prejudice, he classifies Austen's work as an entirely new kind of novel for its time. Whereas romances in the decades preceding Austen pushed the limits of possibility by featuring heroes and heroines enduring extraordinary challenges not usually met with in real life, a book like Emma, quote, neither alarms our credulity nor amuses our imagination by wild variation of incident, or by those pictures of romantic affection and sensibility, which were formerly as certain attributes of fictitious characters as they are rare of occurrence among those who actually live and die, unquote. Scott goes on to say that instead of reusing the stale conventions of an imaginary fictional world full of bold, barely probable kinds of human actions, Austen expends her considerable talent on presenting to readers a correct and striking representation of that which is daily taking place in the ordinary walks of life, as he puts it. What we call ordinary may not exactly fit with the class of characters we meet in Emma, especially Emma Woodhouse herself, but the life Austen writes about was ordinary to her, as well as to many of her readers. As Scott reminds us, Emma is, quote, not about uncommon events arising from the consideration of minds, manners, and sentiments greatly above our own, but confines its art to the middling classes of society. Her most distinguished characters do not rise greatly above the well-bred country gentlemen and ladies, and those which are sketched with most originality and precision belong to a class rather below that standard. The narrative of all her novels is composed of such common occurrences as may have fallen under the observation of most folks, and her dramatis personae conduct themselves upon the motives and principles which the readers may recognize as ruling their own and that of most of their acquaintances." End quote. The range of Austen's fiction, in other words, was familiar and circumscribed, but within that seemingly small compass, were as detailed and observant as a painting by the great Dutch master Vermeer or by the English painter David Wilkie, one of whose works you're looking at now. Austen herself described her creative interests this way in a letter to her nephew, in which she compares the kind of writing he was attempting with what she had already written. "What should I do with your strong, manly, spirited sketches, full of variety and glow? How could I possibly join them to the little bit 2 inches wide of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush as produces little effect after much labor?" she writes. The art of the miniaturist has served, rightly or wrongly, as a model for understanding Austen's meticulous recreations of upper middle-class society. The assumption is further supported by considering two very different aspects of the scope of Emma: the novel's setting and the novel's moral universe. Let's consider the latter with the help of the literary critic Terry Eagleton. Before I read what he has to say, think about other kinds of literary works, allegories and epics, for example, or the plays of the ancient Greek tragedians, whether they talk about good and evil, or virtue and cowardice, justice and crime. These figures who represent such things are larger than life, and they're represented in fully embodied characters with exaggerated qualities and defects. In the highly civilized circles in which Austen moved, and in which her characters move, questions of right and wrong behavior, responsibility and commitment, selfishness and generosity are expressed in far more subtle and nuanced ways. That is because they obey a higher artistic standard of realism and believability. They depend on readers recognizing familiar patterns of behaviors and social situations. Eagleton puts it this way in his book on the English novel: "If morality in Austen involves lonely, uncompromising duty, it is also viewed in a rather different light as closely bound up with social conduct. Since it is about conduct, it can be turned into a code, but since it concerns the fine-grained quality of such behavior, it requires the eye of the novelist more than that of the moral philosopher. It is a matter of tone and nuance, of the telling gesture and the revelatory detail. It concerns small yet critical matters like remembering to light a fire for someone in their room, failing to wait for a companion who has gone off to fetch you a key, dragging a man's furniture around in his absence, or making a sarcastic remark to a spinster. All of this would figure as So we're talking about a kind of smallness with regard to the work of Jane Austen. And from the point of view of the moral universe of that novel, what we see is this minute attention to the behaviors of other people, a kind of hyper scrutiny of the smallest actions, etc., etc. Nothing grand or heroic is going on, but a lot is going on under the surface of manners and the violation of manners. So on another level, what I'm calling smallness, I don't really like using that term to describe the kind of canvas that Austen is working with, is the geographical setting of the novel, which is limited to very specific kinds of locations and areas in England. In the novel, let's look more closely at this landscape in the fictional universe of Emma. We hear about several houses or estates along the way, and the most central one, of course, is the one called Hartfield, where Emma is living with her widowed father. We hear Hartfield mentioned more frequently than any of the other estates that are mentioned, especially in Volume 1. The prominence of Hartfield, just even in terms of mentioning the name and setting a lot of the action at Hartfield, gives it a centrality, a kind of ground zero status, as it were, in relation to which the other locations fall outside of a kind of concentric ring of locations. There is the nearby Randalls, of course, located in the same parish as of Highbury. This is where Mr. Weston lives with his second wife, the former Miss Taylor, who, as the novel opens, relocates from her longtime residence at Hartfield to become mistress of Randalls. Farther off, but not too far, is Donwell Abbey, in the next-door parish of Donwell Abbey, the same name. This is the estate of Mr. George Knightley, of course, a close friend of the Woodhouse family and the largest landowner in the area, as we've seen. Even farther than either of these places is the estate called Enscombe, where a family called Churchill resides. This is relevant because a young man named Frank Churchill, who's about 23 or 24 years old, lives as the adopted son of his aunt and uncle who inhabit Enscombe. Frank is the biological son and only child of Mr. Weston, whose first wife was a Churchill. When she dies, her 5-year-old son is left alone with a single father who agrees to send his boy to Enscombe to be raised by the brother of his former wife, who is married but childless. While there is movement between these various places, it's within a fairly limited area. We hear about the City of London, where Emma's sister Isabella lives with her lawyer husband and 5 children. She's married to John Knightley, of course, the brother of our Donwell Abbey Knightley. So whatever linkages that allow for passage back and forth between places are familial or attached by marriages. If you take a bird's eye view, then, of where we are, you begin to notice all the places that are not mentioned. Very few other locations in England, Scotland, or Ireland are mentioned. France receives one brief, sour remark by Mr. Knightley when he plays with the difference between the English word amiable and that of its French counterpart. This is all the more curious given that most of Jane Austen's early adult life was spent during the Napoleonic Wars that ripped through Europe from 1803 to 1815, the year the English finally defeated the French army at Waterloo, and the year Emma was published, incidentally. Austen even had brothers who were soldiers and naval officers in the British Navy at the time. But this world of war is absent from Jane Austen's world, which, just in terms of the fictional landscape of Emma, is radically reduced to the familiar domestic nearby locations that she knew best. You can add to this a similarly reduced portrayal of character types who represent a very small, exclusive society that does not include a top or bottom. That is, we do not see aristocrats. We do not see non-Anglo foreigners. We do not look too closely into the lives of servants, even though there are many of them working invisibly in these households. We do not see the workers in factories or on poor farms or the urban poor, who by far make up the majority of English citizens, and whose lives are far more miserable than those of the characters that we do encounter. There is one notable brief exception to this, which is the scene featuring Harriet Smith's accidental and nerve-wracking encounter with some gypsy children on her walk. Whereas novels are more than capable of including wider swaths of human experience, Austen's work deliberately adheres to what she knows best. The choice of setting marks the boundaries of her interest, and as those boundaries contract, we as modern readers learn to accept what's there and learn to see the more finely grained, more nuanced conflicts and observations of human behavior that have a value in and of themselves. In other words, what may look to our eyes as trivial bantering about Mr. Woodhouse's eccentric ideas concerning health, or the gossip that circulates about the handsome letter that Frank Churchill sends to Mr. Weston, contains the human drama of aggression, ethical quandaries, desire, social survival, and compassion that a different novelist would handle in some other way. One critic refers to Austen as a master of regulated hatred, for instance. Now, this is not to say that the novel is at all too narrow or too superficial. History does bleed through the text in a number of different ways, including some specific allusions to what's happening in the world, but is, I guess, saturated with a certain kind of attitude that might be said to have emerged out of a middle-class ideology in reaction to the disorder and the chaos and the war and the social fermentation going on outside of that world. So that realism is a kind of practice of containment, a practice of control, against these world forces that impinge, certainly, upon the domestic, but are staved off, are put to the side, or somehow worked into and processed and then dismissed from the fabric of the story that we're being told. So, the artistry of Jane Austen's writing can be seen in every detail. Every detail tells us what she believes novels should do. For instance, Hartfield is the heart of the book because the young woman who gives her name to it, the book that is, lives there. I think Austen's work is best appreciated in the way Terry Eagleton suggests that all novels should be understood as the mythology of a civilization fascinated by its own everyday existence. That's out of Terry Eagleton. Now, before we proceed, it's useful to remind ourselves how early 19th century Englishmen understood rank and social prestige. A specific understanding of these terms is helpful because most of the interesting conflicts in the book have to do with two aspects of class. One, class was very tightly associated with a person's character. In some sense, having a good character would be to belong to a certain class of gentlemen or ladies, for instance. In other words, certain moral qualities, manners, and responsibilities, as well as having traits that demanded respect from others, were tied into birth and or property. To our eyes, this seems kind of inflexible and kind of ridiculous, but we must grasp the distinctions between levels of society in Austen's time to get a full appreciation for the novel. At the very top, then, is the aristocracy. That word aristocracy means something very specific. Nothing is mentioned really in Emma about the aristocracy. It would be incorrect, though, to call Mr. Knightley an aristocrat. That would be inaccurate, even in relation to, say, Harriet Smith or to the Martin family. He is not an aristocrat. After the monarchy itself, which is the rightful way to understand aristocracy, came the 200 or so families whose head was a peer of the realm, duke, a marquess, an earl, a viscount. By 1780, some had incomes reaching £50,000 per year, derived from rents, but often also from holding government office. Their country seats were often on vast estates from which they dispensed political influence, arranged dynastic marriages, and ran the country, essentially. Having no experience of life in such households, Jane Austen never writes about them. The gentry. They are like the lesser aristocracy that I just described, but in a much smaller way. They are landed and they derive their income from rents. About 1,000 of them in Jane Austen's day were titled, but the great majority were not. The two titled ranks were baronet, whose title passed to the eldest son, and knight, whose title died with him. The wives of both ranks took the title of lady, along with their husband's surname. So, for example, Lady Bertram in another Austen novel is a character of this type. If a character in an Austen novel is referred to by her first name, preceded by the title Lady, for instance, Lady Anne Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, that means her father was a peer and she retains her birth title whomever she marries. In Austen's day, the House of Commons was made up of landed gentry, titled or untitled, together with the sons or other close relations of peers, and members of the Irish peerage. Others of this class were public figures locally, becoming sheriffs of their county, justices of the peace, and magistrates. Mr. Knightley, for example, is the magistrate of his particular area. Sharing tastes and outlooks with the landed gentry, and almost certainly intimately related to them, the minor gentry were younger sons and their families whose incomes derived chiefly from the fruits of their professions. The three professions open to a gentleman were the Church of England. Remember George Austen, Jane Austen's father is that kind of person. The armed services, remember she has two brothers in the Navy, and the law. Note that Mr. Knightley's younger brother is a lawyer who lives with his family in London, and that's because he's the younger brother. He doesn't inherit everything because he doesn't occupy the elder position that George does. So together, the lesser landed gentry and the professional minor gentry constituted the world that Jane Austen knew best and was at home in describing. There are signs in Emma, it should be said, of a new emerging middle class that are gaining their wealth and prestige from commercial activity, businessmen, small businessmen. Also, that group would include surgeons and apothecaries, or what we'd call pharmacists. And remember, when I say surgeons or physicians, I'm not talking about the kinds of doctors we know about today. These were largely unlicensed practitioners that you might encounter. And other members of this group would include teachers, musicians, and some attorneys. And they all held a rather precarious position in the ranks of society. These were educated men, but without breeding. Think Mr. Elton in this regard. Beneath them were yeoman farmers, like the Martin family, or tradesmen and clerks who formed the lower middle class. The term middle classes was first used in 1797, and the term working classes used in 1813. So those are very different terms. Before that, the usual words for the levels of society were ranks and orders. The phrase the lower orders persisted into the 20th century. Then there are the laborers, the servants, and the very poor. This was the vast majority of the population in England. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution created horrific conditions for workers in the Midland and northern regions of Austen's England in particular. Servants in Austen's world seem pretty well treated and have shelter and food, but they are rarely mentioned. And we have to keep in mind that Emma incidentally feels a responsibility to visiting the poor of her parish. Given the status that she has, she understands this as part of her responsibility to the community. What does it mean to talk about Emma as a novel? Novels are notoriously hard to define. Even the contemporary literary theorist Guido Mazzoni defines it very broadly as, and I'm quoting, starting from a certain date, the novel became the genre in which one can tell absolutely any story in any way whatsoever. The boundless multiplicity of forms of life, whether real or possible, can be narrated from inside or outside consciousness, and at the same time, any style can be adopted, allowing the variety of the subjective imagination to be revealed. In approaching Emma, a broad definition like Mazzoni's can only get us so far. What's useful in that broadness, though, is the implicit assumption of how close to real life the novel tries to get. Just in terms of how novels represent or simulate the passage of time, for instance, as it is experienced in everyday life, and how that progression of time, unfolding, contains within it incidences that shape the destinies and characters caught in its flux. It has to be seen not as an accurate rendering so much as an artful approximation of what it is like to live in time. The stories or plots the novel tells are moments in the continuum of time, history, or human experiences and memories. They might seem to begin and end nowhere, but novelists must, in a sense, make a case for breaking into that continuum, as well as removing the incidents of the novel from that pause in time to restore its ongoing flux. In other words, how and where do novels begin and end? Are these ways of beginning and ending conventions in the novel form? And if so, what characterizes those conventions? Put another way, think about the opening pages of Emma. Think about Austen's choice of which moment in the title character's private history she begins with, and why. Certainly from what we are told by the narrator, Austen might have begun with Emma as a small child who has just lost her mother. Or we could come into Emma's life at the same time Miss Taylor does, or at a point after Emma marries George Knightley. Most novels begin by marking a disruption or interruption in the otherwise seamless flow of time to establish the sense of a beginning. A different, more microcosmic flow of time is set in motion by what we generally call the plot of the novel. And when that artificial span of contracted time is over, novels return their readers to the real world by crafting the sense of an ending. The question then is whether there is a way to generalize the conventions and characteristics of beginnings and endings in novels. One thing seems evident across the spectrum. Novels begin with a variation in the status quo. In Emma, for example, the departure of Miss Taylor from Hartfield precipitates a kind of breakup in Emma's home life. having assumed over the years the status of a surrogate mother figure for Emma. Pardon me, Miss Taylor's departure to marry Mr. Weston is like a second but far less traumatic loss for both Emma and her father. We encounter Emma on the brink of womanhood, left without a confidant and counselor, and moved into the odd position of mistress of Hartfield and her father's sole companion. In other words, compared against the norms of family roles and relationships that her sister's marriage, say, represent, and that the new union of Mr. Weston and Miss Taylor does also, Emma's familial and emotional, not to mention sexual, relations are somewhat disordered. It is the job of Austen's comic plot to suture these improper relations together in different ways that restores and even enhances the status quo. This restoration and reassertion of norms is what the novel is primarily about. And in many ways, it is, to one degree or another, what most novels are about. It's notable that Emma concludes with 3 marriages between partners whose suitability to each other has to be discovered and affirmed through a number of conflicts and subplots. The institution of marriage in the context of this historical time period, in this particular corner of the world, and within this particular class of people, is the embodiment of a standard and a norm of social life. It is, in a word, the status quo, not a universal standard. It emerges in different ways and to different degrees when the initial conflict of the novel is articulated. The status quo is then the product of its own disruption and relative to whatever fictional world is introducing to us as a disruption. This doesn't mean that all novels restore the disruptions they initiate. Certainly comic novels follow this pattern, but naturalistic novels that explore the working of fate and determinism may have a generally tragic form, one that traces a regression or a degeneration of certain social or ethical norms. It also does not necessarily mean that Austen's novel is wholly conformist or conservative in its worldview. As we know, Austen's satirical tone in many cases produces a kind of edginess and sense of critique of the status quo. Her take on the way girls like Harriet Smith are educated, for example, is hard to miss, and it calls attention to the way her society neglects or underestimates the intellectual capacity of young women. Even Austen's use of marriage is somewhat unusual in this novel, whereas it's easy to see how marriage at how the marriages at the end of the book seem to restore the social order by reining in the errant desires of the 6 people involved. The novel opens with a marriage that disrupts that same sense of order in Emma's life. Besides these larger patterns of disruption and resolution of conflict is another, more individual version of it. At first glance, the title character of the novel seems quite perfect in her way, and not in any need of growth, maturation, learning, or improvement. The famous opening line goes this way: Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. Now, this seems like an image of perfection until you notice that it all hinges upon that word seemed, which implies an illusion disguising a problem. But what problem? What flaw that requires disclosure and remedy? A little farther down, the narrator explains that the real evils indeed of Emma's situation were the power of having rather too much her own way, and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. These were the disadvantages which threatened alloy to her many enjoyments. The danger, however, was at present so unperceived that they did not by any means rank as misfortunes with her." Unquote. Now, what we can take away from these words is that Emma, in the privileged and more knowing estimation of the narrator, is a little too prideful and presumptuous, too careless about her own vast privileges to see the real concerns of those less fortunate around her. Although she means well, she is blind to her faults and must, through conflict and experience, learn to see them and amend them. One thing she comes to learn is that she cannot alone reform the rigid class structure that keeps Harriet Smith from ever marrying above her station, but in the very act of imagining such a possibility, Emma's romantic plotting raises the very question, why not? What makes Emma a compelling character is her capacity to reflect upon her own actions in ways that respond, for instance, to Mr. Knightley's mild reprimands about her treatment of other people. These reprimands, coming as they do from the largest landholder in the story, are as much about not tampering with the social order as they are about not tampering with the sovereignty of other individuals, not using them for one's own amusement. It is this emphasis upon self-reflection, self-judgment, and personal evolution that is a hallmark of novels that reproduce and represent the everyday lives of familiar people. It is also what drives a novelist like Austen to invent ways of conveying those mental processes through devices like free indirect discourse, interior monologues, and the interaction between ideas and behaviors, which I'll explain in a moment.